Frank Fritz and Mike Wolf built one of television's most trusted brands on the idea that history lives in forgotten barns and rusted garages. For 12 years, millions believed they were watching two friends chase the American dream. But the cameras never followed the crew home. They never filmed the lawsuits, the financial disputes, or the warnings that were quietly passed between executives. By the time the public found out, the show had already been canceled for months. American Pickers premiered on January 18, 2010. The History Channel had greenlighted it with cautious expectations, a modest budget, a simple format, no celebrity names attached. What happened next surprised everyone, including the network. By the end of its first season, the show was drawing over 5 million viewers per episode. That number didn't just beat projections. It rewrote them entirely. The premise looked effortless. Two men. A red and white van. Miles of open road and the promise that something valuable was always waiting behind the next rusty gate. It felt spontaneous. Unscripted. Real. It wasn't. According to a 2013 investigation by The Hollywood Reporter, a dedicated team of pre-scouts was operating well ahead of every filming location. They contacted hundreds of property owners per season before a single camera crew left the parking lot. They identified the sites, verified the collections, and cleared access, sometimes weeks in advance. By the time Mike and Frank pulled up in that van, the discovery had already been mapped out. Knowing that production teams had already contacted the sellers before Mike and Frank ever showed up, does that change how you watch the show? Leave your answer below. That gap between appearance and reality was built into the show from the beginning. Mike Wolf had spent over 2 decades running Antique Archaeology, a genuine antiques business based in LeClaire, Iowa, before any television deal existed. He knew the market. He knew the language. He knew how to make a transaction feel like an adventure. That expertise gave the show a layer of authenticity that most reality formats simply couldn't manufacture. Frank Fritz didn't come from that world. Before the cameras, his professional background was in quality control for a manufacturing company. He was likable on screen, easy to watch, naturally funny. But the foundation he was standing on was different from Wolf's, and that difference mattered more as the years went on. By 2013, 3 years into its run, American Pickers had become one of the 10 most watched cable programs in the United States. Merchandise, licensing deals, and advertising revenue had turned the show into an estimated $100 million annual operation. That figure covered everything attached to the brand, not just the broadcast itself, but the stores, the tie-in products, and the steady expansion of Antique Archaeology as a commercial entity riding the show's visibility. Here's what that number actually means. A format built around 2 men buying old things in rural America had become a 9-figure business. And the people who built it on camera were not necessarily the ones controlling it off camera. The fortune being built around the show's brand was impressive. But the question of who actually controlled that fortune would not become clear for another 8 years. The show sold a friendship. That was the product, underneath all the antiques and the open road. 2 guys who genuinely seemed to enjoy each other's company, ribbing each other over prices, splitting a diner breakfast somewhere in rural Ohio. It was warm. It was watchable. And for a long time, it was convincing. What the production was actually managing was something more complicated. According to multiple interviews Fritz gave between 2019 and 2021, he had been dealing with serious health issues for most of the show's run. In 2012, just 2 years into filming, he was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. It's a chronic condition. It doesn't go away between seasons. It requires ongoing management, dietary discipline, and sometimes medical intervention that doesn't fit neatly around a production schedule. Fritz was open about this in later years, but during the show's peak, it was never discussed publicly. By 2020, the strain was visible in the numbers. Fritz was absent from 11 episodes during the show's 21st season. That's not a scheduling conflict. That's a sustained absence across a significant portion of a season. Production sources later confirmed to People magazine that his behavior on set had become unpredictable, in ways that created real complications around scheduling and, critically, around insurance. Insurance is not a dramatic word. But in television production, it controls everything. If a key talent becomes difficult to insure, the entire production becomes harder to finance. While Fritz was navigating all of that, Wolf was moving in a different direction entirely. Antique Archaeology had expanded to a second location in Nashville. He was doing brand partnerships. He was operating less like a picker and more like a franchise. The show was still the centerpiece, but for Wolf, it had become one part of a much larger commercial operation. Almost every long-running collaboration contains this fault line. One person building forward, the other working to stay level. It doesn't require bad intentions on either side. It just requires time, and different circumstances, and the slow divergence that follows. Fritz's exit from American Pickers was never formally announced. In July 2021, the History Channel confirmed, with minimal detail, that he would not be returning. No statement explained the decision. No press release offered context. The network said almost nothing. That silence was more revealing than anything they could have written. By mid-2021, one of cable television's longest-running reality shows had quietly lost half of its founding cast. What happened next is where the story gets complicated. Frank Fritz didn't leave quietly. Within weeks of the History Channel's confirmation that he wouldn't be returning, Fritz sat down for an interview with The Sun. And what he said was specific. He claimed that Mike Wolf had not contacted him once, not a single time, during the 9-month period when Fritz was reportedly receiving treatment for his health complications. 9 months. No call. No message. Nothing. That is not a vague grievance. That is a datable, verifiable claim about a specific window of time. Wolf responded publicly on Instagram. The post expressed concern for Fritz's well-being. It wished him recovery. It said kind things in careful language. What it did not do, not once, was address the specific claim about contact. It didn't deny it. It didn't explain it. It simply moved around it. Then, in August 2021, Fritz suffered a stroke. He was 55 years old. He was hospitalized. And whatever remaining ambiguity existed about the circumstances of his exit evaporated immediately. Public interest shifted from curiosity to something sharper. A former coworker, quoted by TMZ in the weeks that followed, alleged that the production environment had grown hostile in the months before Fritz's removal. According to that account, at least one formal complaint had been filed internally regarding how filming decisions were being made. Neither Cineflix Productions nor A&E Networks, the parent company of the History Channel, confirmed any part of that allegation. But they didn't deny it either. What they said collectively was nothing. The personal conflict between Fritz and Wolf was generating headlines. But the legal threat that would do the most structural damage to the show had nothing to do with either of them personally. In 2020, at least 3 property owners filed legal complaints against the production. Their argument was straightforward. Items that appeared on American Pickers, items they had sold to the show, had been misrepresented in terms of price. Some of those sellers claimed they received thousands of dollars less than what the items later fetched at auction. They had sold at one price. The market had valued the same objects at a substantially higher one. And they believed the production knew the difference. If you have ever sold something at a price someone else set, and later found out what it was actually worth, this dynamic is not unique to television. It is structural. It exists in real estate negotiations, in estate sales, in any transaction where one party has significantly more information than the other. The settlement agreements reached with those property owners contain specific language that was never reported in any trade publication, and that language directly connects to why production insurance became unworkable. That part of the story is coming. The property owner complaints were ultimately settled without going to trial. But the legal language used in those settlements contained a clause that network attorneys almost certainly didn't expect to become public. By 2023, the History Channel was calling it a hiatus. That word does a specific kind of work. It implies a pause. A temporary stop. Something that will resume when the conditions are right. What it rarely means, in practice, is what it sounds like. While the show sat in that undefined space, the business around it kept moving. Wolf's Nashville location of antique archaeology had generated an estimated $2 million in retail revenue in its first full year of operation. The original store in LeClaire, Iowa, the one that existed before the cameras, before the network deal, before any of it, was still drawing busloads of tourists. People who had driven hours, sometimes from other states, to stand in a building made famous by a show that was no longer in regular production. They came anyway. They bought things. They took photographs. The machine was still running. The engine had stopped. According to trademark filings reviewed by entertainment law analysts, licensing revenue tied to the American Pickers name continued to flow through the end of 2023. At least 14 active trademark registrations existed under the American Pickers brand at that point, covering a range that extended well beyond television, into clothing lines, travel experiences, and retail categories that had nothing to do with antiques or picking. A name can outgrow the person who made it valuable. That is not a metaphor. It is a legal and commercial reality with a paper trail. Fritz, by 2022, had recovered enough from his stroke to speak publicly again. In a limited interview with TMZ that year, he said he would like to return to the show. He said he had received no contact from the network. His Crohn's condition had reportedly stabilized by late 2022, though no medical confirmation was ever issued publicly. He was healthy enough to work. Nobody called. There is something difficult to name in that specific situation. A person, recovered, willing, available, watching a brand built partly on their presence continue generating revenue without them. It doesn't fit neatly into any single category of unfairness. It's not dramatic enough for a lawsuit headline. It's quieter than that. Anyone who has been through a business split, a partnership that dissolved badly, or a professional exit that happened on someone else's terms will likely recognize what that silence feels like. Not the loud ending. The one where everything just continues, without you. American Pickers was never formally cancelled. That is the first thing worth understanding. In late 2023, the History Channel described the show's status as a break between seasons. That phrase was doing a lot of quiet work. It acknowledged nothing. It closed nothing. It left the door technically open while everything behind it was already being cleared out. As of early 2024, according to industry tracking data maintained by Deadline Hollywood, no new episodes had been scheduled. Nothing had been greenlit. There was no production timeline. There was no announcement. There was just silence, dressed up as a pause. This is not an accident. Networks have used this approach with increasing frequency since at least 2018. A formal cancellation announcement carries a cost: press coverage, public reaction, questions that require answers. A quiet expiration carries none of that. The show simply stops appearing. Viewers notice eventually. By then, the news cycle has moved on. It is a softer ending. But it is still an ending. The reasons behind it were layered. The first was cost. Production expenses for location-based reality television had increased by roughly 30% between 2019 and 2023. Some of that came from COVID-era logistics pricing that never fully normalized. Fuel, crew travel, location access, all of it cost more than it did before the pandemic, and the budgets hadn't adjusted to match. But the more specific problem was insurance. The property owner complaints from 2020, even after settlement, had left a mark on the show's insurance profile. The writers required to continue production had become substantially more expensive. That cost had to be absorbed somewhere. At a certain point, it couldn't be. The second reason was the ratings. At its peak in 2012, American Pickers was pulling 5.4 million viewers per episode. By its final airings in 2023, that number had fallen to approximately 1.1 million, a decline of nearly 80% over 11 years, according to Nielsen data published by TV by the Numbers. That trajectory is not a collapse. A collapse is sudden. This was a managed erosion, slow, measurable, and entirely predictable to anyone watching the numbers closely. At 5 million viewers, the math works. Advertising rates hold. Licensing partners stay interested. At 1.1 million, the same math produces different answers. Anyone who has watched something they believed was permanent quietly disappear, a job, a business, an institution, without any public acknowledgement that it was over will recognize this specific experience. The thing ends. Nobody says so. You're just supposed to figure it out. What the ratings data and the litigation costs don't explain is why at least 2 production deals were reportedly in conversation as recently as mid-2023, and why both of them fell through without a single public statement. When a television show ends, the time slot goes dark and most people assume that's the whole story. It isn't. American Pickers left behind 2 functioning retail operations. It left behind at least 14 active trademark registrations covering products and experiences that had nothing to do with broadcasting. It left behind a YouTube channel that, as of late 2023, was still pulling consistent 6-figure annual ad revenue from an archive of over 300 uploaded clips. The show had stopped producing new content. The revenue hadn't noticed. But the people most affected by the production pause were not the ones whose names were on the trademark filings. According to production crew interviews given anonymously to Reality Blurred in 2022, a full-time crew of 19 people had been working on the show across its final 4 seasons. Camera operators, sound technicians, producers, logistics coordinators, people who had built their professional schedules around this production. When the pause came, their contracts were not renewed. And because those contracts had been structured as per-project agreements rather than standard employment, none of those 19 people qualified for typical severance protections. The work simply stopped. The protections that come with conventional employment never applied. That is the part of the story that doesn't make headlines. Fritz's most candid public statement came in a 2023 social media post. He wrote that he had spent 2 years trying to figure out who he was without the show. That sentence doesn't need any additional framing. It stands on its own. Most people watching this have worked somewhere, trusted someone, or built an identity around something that was ultimately controlled by someone else, and found out too late that the thing they thought they were building didn't belong to them in the way they assumed. The American Pickers story is not a television story. It is a precise, well-documented version of something that happens constantly and quietly, in offices, in partnerships, in careers that look stable right up until the moment they aren't. The names change. The structure doesn't. The documented record of what happened to American Pickers is detailed in some places and conspicuously empty in others. Wolf has given multiple interviews since 2021. They cover the antique business. They cover his stores, his finds, his passion for preservation. What they consistently avoid are direct questions about Fritz, about the show's future, and about the circumstances of the split. The omissions are not accidental. They are too consistent for that. Fritz has been more forthcoming. He has spoken about his health, his stroke, his recovery, his willingness to return. But legal analysts who spoke with entertainment trade publication The Wrap in 2023 noted something specific about his public statements. He has never, in any interview or post, named specific production company personnel. Not once. That pattern, according to those analysts, is consistent with the language typically found in a non-disparagement agreement. Such agreements are common in television exits. They are also, by design, invisible. Neither Fritz nor Wolf has confirmed or denied that one exists. What is confirmed is this: Cineflix Productions, the Canadian company that owned the show's format rights, renewed its underlying option on the American Pickers format in 2022. That information comes from Canadian trademark filings. It means that while the History Channel was going quiet and the production was pausing, the company that controlled the format was making sure it retained the legal right to use it. That is not the behavior of an organization that considers something finished. A reboot with a new cast was an informal discussion as recently as late 2023, according to a source quoted by Reality Blurred. That source noted specifically that neither Wolf nor Fritz was attached to those conversations. Not consulted. Not included. The brand they built, the name, the format, the premise, was being discussed for a second life that had no seat at the table for either of them. This is the part that extends beyond television. The thing most people think they are building, a career, a reputation, a creative legacy, is often legally separable from the person who built it. A name can be trademarked. A format can be optioned. A show can be rebooted. None of those actions require the original person's involvement. Sometimes the thing outlives the relationship that created it entirely. Sometimes it outlives the creator's ability to participate in it at all. One name connected to those reboot conversations has not appeared in any public reporting. That name is still active in the production industry today, and has a prior connection to at least 2 other reality television formats that ended under similarly quiet circumstances.